Richard Nixon and the Vietnam War. In the summer of 1968, the Republican Party nominated Richard Nixon for the presidency. He had been Eisenhower's vice president before Kennedy. He differed from Eisenhower because he wanted to send troops to Vietnam in 1954 to help the French at Dien Bien Phu. Yet during the election campaign of 1968, he promised his new leadership would end the war and win peace in the Pacific. Nixon won the election with 43.4% of the vote. When he took up office, up to 300 soldiers were dying per week in Vietnam. His election victory meant he could decide American policy in Vietnam. His options were continue Johnson's policy of all-out war in the South, already proving to be an unsuccessful policy. Extend the bombing campaign to the north, but in doing this it risked the involvement of China and the USSR. Use nuclear weapons, again this risked the involvement of China and the USSR. Or turn over the war to the Vietnamese to fight, making them do the fighting with American equipment. Nixon chose the last option, a program called Vietnamization. The basic principle was that the South Vietnam would slowly take over all civil and military aspects of the war. American combat troops would be withdrawn, unit by unit, while continuing to give air and naval support to the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, the South Vietnamese Army, and rearm the South Vietnamese Army with the best military equipment America had to offer. Vietnamization meant that South Vietnamese government had to fight if it wanted to survive. Vietnamization proved to be a disastrous choice. It prolonged the war by 4 years and cost the lives of more American soldiers. The US began holding peace talks. They wanted South Vietnam to be left alone to determine its own future without foreign, meaning Hanoi, North Vietnam, China and the USSR interfering. The Americans wanted reunification or North and South Vietnam to be remain separate, but only if all Vietnam voted in favor of free elections, and 2, a democratic leader was to remain in power. They wanted the North Vietnamese army to be removed from South Vietnam. This is what the Americans called peace with honor. The basic difference between the Johnson and Nixon administrations was that Johnson believed in military victory, whereas Nixon knew the United States could not win the war, at least at a price that the nation. Nixon realized that for economic reasons, the war was simply costing too much, and for the sake of domestic peace, he had to cut back on the American commitment to Vietnam, which meant in turn accepting an outcome short of victory. On the 8th of June 1969, Nixon announced the first US troop withdrawals from Vietnam. By August 1st, he said 25,000 American soldiers would be returned to the United States. Further reductions would follow as the Army of the Republic of Vietnam's fighting quality improved. It was a turning point. Johnson's policy of escalation in Vietnam had now been reversed. It was an act forced on Nixon by public opinion. Nixon also created a lottery system to determine who would get drafted, which made the selective service process fairer to all classes and groups. After this, the anti-war movement died down for a time. Despite this, Nixon was still prepared to take military action against the North Vietnamese army. He ordered the secret invasion of Cambodia with the objective of driving the North Vietnamese army out of Cambodia and destroy the North Vietnamese supply routes into Cambodia, the Ho Chi Minh Trail. This was, obviously, well known to the Cambodians and Vietnamese, but Nixon managed to keep it from the American public and from the American Congress through 4 years of intensive bombing. Unfortunately, the return on this policy was low. At their best, America's B-52s caused a 10% fall-off in the movement of men and supplies from North to South Vietnam via Cambodia. Peace talks continued throughout 1972, but with little success. However, Nixon claimed that his policy of peace with honor was near. This helped 60% of the voters to choose Nixon again in the 1972 presidential election. More importantly, the Democrats controlled Congress and were ready to reassert themselves. Nixon knew that the new Congress coming into office in 1973 was going to cut off all funds for bombing. Nixon therefore agreed to sign a compromise ceasefire agreement in Vietnam. Thieu was allowed to remain in power while the US would let the North Vietnamese army stay in South Vietnam. On January 23, 1973, all active American participation in Vietnam ended. Eventually, the agreed ceasefire broke down. All that had really been agreed was that the USA would pull its fighting men out of Vietnam and that Hanoi would give back American prisoners of war. Over the next 2 years, the battle between Thieu, the new leader of South Vietnam, and the communists raged on. By April 1975, the Communists had taken over South Vietnam and its capital, Saigon, and it was renamed Ho Chi Minh City.